The wind howled across the New Mexico plains like a wounded animal, carrying dust and rain in wild spirals that stung the skin and blurred the eyes. The stagecoach that had been Clara Whitfield's only means westward was now nothing more than a twisted wreck half buried in the mud. The driver was gone, either fled or dead, and the horses had vanished into the storm hours ago. Clara stood beside the shattered coach, her bonnet torn away, her blue dress streaked with dirt, clutching the leather satchel that held the last of her belongings, a worn Bible, 2 letters, and the photograph of the man she was supposed to marry. Benjamin Caraway, a wealthy rancher of fine reputation and vast holdings. His letters had promised warmth, safety, and the kind of home she had never known back east. But now, as the thunder rolled across the desert and lightning struck the horizon, Clara realized the cruel truth of it. She was alone in a country that didn't forgive the weak. She began walking. The mud sucked at her boots and the cold gnawed through the thin fabric of her clothes. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, a habit born of fear. "You're not lost. Not yet. Just keep walking, Clara." Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. It was impossible to tell under the relentless rain. The desert, once bright and endless, had turned into a shadowed maze of rock and scrub. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she climbed a low ridge, praying for the sight of smoke, a fence, a light, anything human. Then she saw it. A faint glow, flickering against the stone walls of a canyon not far below. It wasn't much, just a thread of light in the storm, but it pulled her like salvation. She stumbled down the slope, scraping her palms on the rocks, her skirts heavy with mud. The wind tore at her hair, but she didn't stop until she stood before a small cabin, weathered, half hidden beneath a ledge of sandstone. Smoke curled from the chimney. She hesitated at the door. The world had taught her to be cautious, especially out here, where law and mercy were often miles apart. But the cold had already begun to numb her fingers and stiffen her lips. Whatever lay beyond that door couldn't be worse than dying alone in the rain. She lifted her hand and knocked. The sound was small against the storm. Once, twice, then again, louder. From inside came the scrape of boots on wood, the metallic click of a rifle bolt. Clara's heart leapt to her throat. The door opened just enough for a man's eyes to appear, dark, sharp, and unreadable beneath a wet brim of black hair. He said nothing. I'm lost," Clara stammered, trying to steady her breath. "The coach, it overturned in the storm. Please, I need shelter for the night." The man studied her in silence. His face was part shadow, part firelight, and even in the dim glow she could see the hard lines carved deep by years of sun and grief. Scars crossed one cheek like the marks of a blade. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his chest bare and bronzed beneath it. At last, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice low, rough, and unused. Clara entered hesitantly. The cabin was sparse but clean, a small fire burning in the hearth, a rifle hanging over the mantel, and a single blanket folded neatly on a cot. The scent of smoke and sage filled the air. The man shut the door and leaned his rifle against the wall. "You shouldn't be here," he said after a long pause. "I didn't plan to be," she answered, her voice soft but firm. Their eyes met, hers wide with exhaustion and fear, his with something unreadable, like a storm behind glass. Neither spoke again for several minutes. The fire crackled between them, and outside the desert roared. It was only then that Clara realized she had stumbled not just into the home of a stranger, but into the heart of a man who had been silent for 15 long years, and for reasons she couldn't yet name. She felt that her knocking on that door had awakened something buried deep within him. By dawn, the storm had quieted, leaving a pale mist clinging to the canyon like breath frozen in the air. Clara awoke to the crackle of the fire and the smell of coffee. Her head throbbed, her hands ached, and her dress had dried stiff from the night before. For a moment she forgot where she was, until she saw the man sitting near the hearth, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He hadn't looked at her once. She sat up, drawing the blanket closer around her shoulders. The cabin was Small. One room, one cot, one man who carried silence like a second skin. His movements were precise, his posture straight even in stillness. There was a strength about him that was more dangerous than loudness could ever be. He broke the quiet first. "Coffee's there." His voice was gravelly, like it hadn't been used much in years. Clara hesitated before reaching for the tin cup beside the fire. It was bitter but warm, and for that alone she was grateful. "Thank you," she murmured. The man nodded once, still not looking at her. "I never caught your name," she tried. He glanced up at that, eyes dark as obsidian, and for a heartbeat she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said simply, "Talon." The name suited him, sharp, quiet, dangerous. "And yours?" "Clara Whitfield." He nodded again, as if filing it away like a fact that didn't concern him. He rose and stepped outside without another word. Through the open door, Clara saw him move across the clearing with the sure-footedness of someone who belonged to the land. He checked his horse, gathered firewood, and returned with a rabbit strung over his shoulder. Every motion was measured, every breath controlled. When he returned, she found the courage to ask, "Are we near a settlement? I was supposed to reach one yesterday." The coach was headed for Caraway Ranch. At the name, Talon's hands froze. For a second, the mask slipped. The faintest flicker of something crossed his face before he turned back to skinning the rabbit. "You're far from there," he said at last. 2 days by horse, more on foot." Clara sighed, pressing her palms together. "Then I've caused you trouble. I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," he said quietly. "Storm brought you. Storm will take you when it's done." She wasn't sure if that was kindness or dismissal. As the morning went on, she began to notice the details of the place. A handmade bow rested by the door. Carvings of hawks and eagles adorned the shelves. A faded piece of beadwork hung near the bed. Apache craft, unmistakable. That, and his copper skin and dark hair, told her what he did not say. He was of two worlds, neither fully accepted by either. "Are you?" She hesitated, unsure if the question was rude. "Apache?" He paused over the fire, his back to her. "Once," he said. "Not anymore." There was a weight in those words that made her throat tighten. She wanted to ask more, to understand how a man could stop being what he was born. But something in his shoulders warned her not to. When he finally turned, his gaze caught hers with quiet intensity. "You should rest. The ground's still soft from the rain. I'll ride you out when it dries." His tone left no room for argument. As he stepped outside again, Clara watched him disappear among the red cliffs, his figure blending with the land like a spirit of the desert. She should have been relieved. He was helping her, expecting nothing in return. But the longer she stayed, the more questions filled her heart. Why did he live alone out here? Why had his eyes darkened when she said Caraway? And why did his silence feel heavier than any words? When night fell again, she sat by the fire waiting for him to return. The air was still, save for the distant call of a coyote. And somewhere deep in her bones, Clara felt it. The quiet hum of something waking. Talon Gray had been silent for 15 long years. But something about her presence had begun to stir the heart he had buried. The next morning broke golden and still, the kind of peace that comes only after a storm has spent itself. The canyon was washed clean, red rock gleaming, air sweet with the scent of wet sage. Clara stepped outside for the first time since arriving, blinking against the brightness. For a moment it felt like stepping into another world. Talon was already awake, working by the corral. He moved with quiet efficiency, tightening a saddle strap, checking his horse's hooves, his long hair tied at the nape of his neck. He hadn't spoken since dawn, but Clara had grown used to that. His silence wasn't cruel. It was protective, like the hush before thunder. She hesitated near the doorway, unsure whether to approach him or stay inside. "Can I help with anything?" she asked finally. He didn't look up. "No," she bit her lip, trying not to let his curt reply sting. The man wasn't unkind, but he built walls higher than the canyon itself, and yet she couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt toward him. the way his stillness seemed to hide 1,000 unspoken things. "I'm not afraid to work," she pressed. "My father owned a small farm in Kansas. I can mend fences, fetch water, cook." "You should rest," he said, voice even. "You're not staying long enough to work." Something in her chest tightened. "You make it sound as if you can't wait for me to be gone." He turned then, eyes dark as storm clouds. "You don't belong here," he said softly. "No one does." The words struck her harder than they should have. She wanted to argue, to demand he tell her what haunted him so fiercely. But before she could speak, a sound shattered the stillness, the sharp echo of hooves on stone. Talon stiffened instantly, every muscle alert. He motioned for her to get inside. Without thinking, she obeyed. Through the crack in the door, she watched as 2 riders emerged from the canyon pass. Rough-looking men, one carrying a rifle across his saddle, the other wearing the wide grin of trouble. "Morning," the first one called out, reining in his horse a few yards from the cabin. "Heard there's a white man living up in Apache country. Didn't believe it till now." Talon didn't answer. He stood motionless, hand resting casually near the knife at his belt. The second rider spat into the dirt. "Got any whiskey to share, half-breed?" Clara's stomach twisted. She wanted to run, to yell, to stop whatever was about to happen. But Talon's calmness, his eerie, deadly calmness, held her frozen. "No whiskey here," he said quietly, "and no welcome for thieves." The men laughed, dismounting. "We ain't thieves," one said, grinning wide. "Just looking for a woman, blonde, young. Word is a coach went down last night." "You seen her?" Clara's breath caught. Talon's eyes flicked toward the cabin door for only a fraction of a second, but the riders noticed. "There it is," one said, grinning. "Looks like you did find her." Talon's voice dropped lower, quiet as a blade sliding from its sheath. "You should leave now." The first man reached for his gun. The next moments blurred. There was a flash of movement, a cry, the thud of boots against stone. Talon moved like a striking hawk, swift, silent, precise. One man fell, gun ripped from his hand. The other stumbled back, bleeding from a cut across his arm. "Tell your boss," Talon said, his tone cold as the canyon wind. "The canyon is closed. He comes here again, he won't ride out." The men scrambled to their horses and fled. For a long moment, the only sound was the ragged beat of Clara's heart. When Talon turned toward her, his face was calm again, but his eyes burned. "You didn't tell me," he said, voice low and sharp, "that you belonged to Benjamin Carraway." Her blood ran cold. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, trembling. "He's the man I was supposed to marry, but I never even met him." Talon stared at her for a long, long time. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Then fate sent you to the wrong door." And with those words, she saw it, the flicker of an old pain, deep and raw, breaking through the silence he'd carried for 15 years. The storm outside was gone, but inside Talon Gray another had just begun. The morning after the attack brought an uneasy calm to the canyon. Clara awoke to the smell of coffee and the faint metallic tang of the rain-soaked earth. The cabin, though battered by the storm and the previous day's confrontation, felt safer than the world outside. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe fully. Talon Gray, however, had not changed. He was already up, tending the small fire and checking the perimeter with the meticulous care of a man who had survived far too much. He moved with the precision of someone whose body remembered every danger the desert could throw. Every glance he cast toward the horizon was wary, every motion measured. But something in his presence today was different, less like a predator and more like a guardian. Clara tried not to watch him too closely, but she couldn't help it. There was a weight to him, a stillness that spoke of years spent alone, years of grief and anger suppressed beneath his copper skin. Yet in moments when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes softened as if her very presence had nudged a tiny crack into the stone walls around his heart. "Breakfast?" she offered, placing a small pile of dried meat and cornmeal cakes on a rough wooden table. Talon looked at it, his expression unreadable, but he nodded slightly and accepted it without a word. Clara watched him chew slowly, carefully as though even eating demanded control. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling and the wind whispering through the canyon walls. Then Clara, her courage finally finding a foothold, spoke. "You could talk to me, you know. You don't have to stay silent." He paused, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the table. "Silence is safer." "Safer for who?" she asked softly. You or me? His jaw tightened. Both. She could sense the weight behind his words, the ghosts he carried, the memories that had made him retreat from the world 15 years ago. And yet, there was something in the way he let her presence linger in the cabin, in the quiet moments they shared near the fire, that told her he was beginning to reconsider the solitude he had chosen. As the day passed, Clara helped with small chores. She fed the few animals he kept, gathered water from the nearby creek, and repaired the roof with tarps, salvaged from the wreckage of her coach. Talon watched her work but offered only minimal instruction. And yet, in his careful corrections, there was a subtle patience that Clara hadn't expected from a man so distant and dangerous. That afternoon, when the sun dipped low and painted the canyon walls a deep gold, they stood together by the creek, Talon skipping stones across the surface. Clara noticed that he wasn't as rigid as before. His shoulders relaxed, his movements were less tense. He glanced at her once, eyes meeting hers briefly, and then looked away. That small fleeting contact was enough to set her heart racing. You're, she began, unsure how to finish the thought. Dangerous? He interrupted, his voice dry. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. Not that, strong, patient, I didn't think anyone could survive this canyon alone for so long. His gaze lingered on her, a slow, unreadable calculation passing behind his eyes. Then he simply said, I survive because I have to. Clara understood then that survival wasn't just about the body. It was about the heart, about the parts of oneself one locks away when the world has been cruel enough. And for the first time she sensed that Talon's heart, long silent and frozen by grief, might be thawing. Not because of words, but because of shared moments, quiet glances, and a presence neither of them had expected. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind sighed through the canyon, Clara settled onto the cot, listening to Talon's measured breathing from across the room. She realized with a sudden, thrilling fear that she was beginning to care for the man who had once promised himself silence. A man whose heart had not known love in 15 long years, and in the dark, with the stars spilling through the cabin window, she felt it, the first stirrings of something dangerous, something powerful. Talon Gray, the silent Apache, was beginning to remember how to feel. The canyon lay bathed in the golden haze of early morning when Clara awoke to the distant sound of hooves. It was faint at first, a whisper against the wind, but gradually it grew sharper, a reminder that the world beyond Talon Gray's cabin was never truly still. Clara's heart quickened. She had begun to feel the strange, fragile comfort of the cabin, the warmth of fire and shelter, the beginnings of trust in a man whose silence had been both shield and weapon. But now that fragile sense of safety trembled like a candle in the wind. Talon was already awake, standing near the doorway, eyes scanning the horizon. When he turned to her, his gaze was hard, wary, etched with a tension that had returned overnight. They're coming, he said quietly. Clara frowned. Who? Carraway, he replied, his voice clipped barely above a whisper. Benjamin Carraway. The name hit her like a lash. The man she had been promised in letters, the man she thought was merely a wealthy rancher awaiting her arrival, was not just a distant figure in her future. He was a man who carried danger, a history Talon seemed to fear as much as he feared no one else. Clara stepped closer. What does he want? She asked, though a part of her already knew. Talon's eyes darkened, shadowed by memory. He took everything from me 15 years ago, he said slowly. My family, my people, my trust. He sold the lands, betrayed those who relied on him. I should have killed him then. I should have buried the past in the desert and left him to rot in his greed. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. Clara, he said, this isn't just about you. He's here for the land I protect, for the valley I've kept hidden. And now, for you. The weight of his words sank into her. The man she had been promised as a husband was no ordinary rancher. He was a predator, calculating with the power to destroy everything Talon had fought to preserve. The storm of 15 years past was riding toward them, carried on horses and guns and the ruthless determination of a man who would take anything he wanted. Clara swallowed, trying to steady herself. Then we have to prepare. We can't let him. We won't, Talon interrupted, his tone firm, eyes flashing with a fire she had never seen before. I've survived worse than Carraway. You think 15 years of silence could make a man soft? I've spent every day planning, watching, waiting. He won't touch you, and he won't take my valley. For the first time, Clara saw the full breadth of Talon's past, the scars on his face, yes, but also the quiet strength that had carried him through years of solitude and loss. He was a man shaped by pain, yes, but also by purpose, a man whose heart had been silent only because it had learned to survive on its own. By mid-afternoon, they began preparations. Talon mapped escape routes through the canyon, checked traps he had set long ago, and moved with the precision of a hunter who had never once forgotten the lessons of blood and betrayal. Clara followed his instructions, her own fear tempered by resolve. She gathered water, reinforced the cabin doors, and kept watch from a ledge above, her eyes scanning the horizon for movement. And then, as the sun dipped low and painted the canyon walls a deep amber, Clara understood something new. This man, this silent Apache, was no longer just her protector. He was a living testament to endurance, a man who had buried his heart only to rise from the ashes when the right person appeared. She glanced at Talon, who was crouched beside a concealed path, a knife in hand, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. In that moment, she felt something shift, not just fear or gratitude, but a budding admiration and perhaps the first fragile tendrils of love. The past had ridden back into their lives, fierce and unrelenting, but so had the future, whispered in small gestures, glances, and the unspoken promise that Talon Gray would not only survive it, he would protect her through it. And in that realization, Clara understood the truth. She had knocked on the wrong door. And yet she had arrived at exactly the right place. The canyon air had turned sharp with the promise of evening, and shadows stretched long across the red rocks as Clara and Talon made their preparations. The distant ridge glimmered with sunlight reflecting off metal, the first glint of Caraway's men approaching. Every hoofbeat, every shift of dust against the horizon reminded them both that time was running out. Clara had never seen Talon like this, alert, precise, moving with the silent authority of a man who had lived too long in danger to ever underestimate it. He had checked his traps twice, repaired the old cabin doors, and even dug a shallow pit covered with brush to slow any intruders. And yet, despite the careful planning, Clara sensed that he was already calculating far beyond what she could see. "We have to make a deal," Talon said quietly, as they crouched behind a boulder, overlooking the canyon pass. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the horizon. "If Caraway wants the valley, he'll need information. If I give him a reason to think he can have it, just enough to buy time, we can lure him into the canyon where I have the advantage." Clara's brow furrowed. "You mean, lie to him?" Talon's gaze met hers, sharp and unyielding. "Sometimes survival requires words you don't mean. Sometimes it requires trusting me even when you don't want to." Her pulse raced. She had trusted men before and had been betrayed. But there was something in the way Talon's hand brushed the knife at his belt, in the unwavering steadiness of his gaze, that told her he was unlike anyone she had ever known. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Act like you belong to Caraway. Speak his name if he asks. Lead him to believe he has leverage." Clara swallowed hard. The plan was dangerous, recklessly so, but she sensed no other choice. If she refused, Caraway's greed could claim them both, and Talon's carefully guarded valley could be lost forever. The sun dipped lower, and shadows melted into the canyon floor. Then, as predicted, the first riders appeared, their figures cut sharp against the fading light. Caraway's men, armed and confident, called out across the canyon, mocking and demanding. Clara stepped forward from behind the boulder, heart pounding. Talon's hand touched her shoulder briefly, a silent reminder to stay calm. "Say nothing," he mouthed. When the leader demanded, "Is she with you, Talon? Or is she mine?" Clara's voice quivered but carried across the canyon. "She's here for Caraway," she said, her tone even. "She came willingly." Talon's jaw tightened. His grip on his knife didn't falter, but his eyes never left the canyon pass. Caraway's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Well, looks like we found our prize. Lead me to her, Talon, or I'll take her by force." Talon didn't answer. Instead, he signaled Clara to move back behind a screen of boulders. His body became a shadow among shadows, each step silent, deliberate. He had laid the canyon like a trap years ago, preparing for a day when greed would come knocking, and now that day had arrived. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, but finally, the balance shifted. Caraway's men, emboldened by the presence of the woman they thought was theirs, moved carelessly. Talon's trap sprung, a small ambush of smoke, noise, and falling rocks that disoriented the riders. Clara watched, trembling, as the man who had been silent for 15 years moved like a storm unleashed. His knives flashed, his voice broke the air once sharply, enough to warn, enough to dominate. And when it was over, Caraway's men were scattered, retreating into the canyon's folds, shaken but alive. Talon approached her then, silent again, but his eyes softened for the briefest instant. "Did you see? Did you survive?" Clara nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. And in that moment she realized something terrifying and exhilarating. Talon Gray was not just her protector. He was a force of nature, bound to the canyon, to its secrets, and now to her. As night settled over the canyon, the stars glimmering like distant fires, Clara knew this was only the beginning. They had survived the first danger, but Caraway would return, and the next encounter could be far deadlier. Yet in Talon's quiet strength, she felt a spark of hope and something else, something she dared not name. For the first time, she sensed that the silent Apache's heart, buried for 15 years, might be ready to beat again. Night draped the canyon in a deep indigo, and the stars shimmered like distant lanterns over the cliffs. The wind had stilled, leaving only the gentle murmur of the creek as it wound through the valley. Inside the cabin, Clara sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Every nerve in her body still hummed from the day's confrontation, the ambush, the trap's Talon's deadly precision. He was crouched on the floor across from her, cleaning his knife with the same meticulous care he had shown for years. His gaze flicked toward her occasionally, silent but piercing, and she realized with a start that he had been watching her all evening, not with suspicion but with calculation, as if trying to read her thoughts, her fears, her courage. "I didn't want to marry him," she said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was small but firm. "Benjamin Caraway. I answered the ad because I wanted a way out of my life. I never even wanted to meet him." Talon paused mid-motion, knife in hand. The firelight danced across his sharp features, illuminating the scars on his face and the tension in his shoulders. He didn't speak, but his silence spoke volumes. Curiosity, disbelief, something like hope hidden behind the shadows of his eyes. "I was afraid," Clara continued, her hands trembling slightly. "Afraid I'd fail, afraid I'd end up alone or worse. But I never thought I'd meet someone like you out here." Talon finally looked at her. The firelight reflected in his dark eyes, revealing a depth of feeling she hadn't seen before. For the first time in 15 years, the walls around his heart seemed to shiver. He said nothing, but his gaze held her like a promise. Silent, unwavering, impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't trust me," he said at last, voice low, carrying the weight of all the years he had spent alone. "I'm not like other men." "I don't want other men," Clara whispered, leaning forward. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, close enough to almost touch him. "I want you, if you let me." A flicker of emotion passed over Talon's face, a quick tightening of the jaw, a small exhale. He had not expected this, not after so many years of silence, solitude, and loss. And yet, he found that he could not push her away. Not her, not the spark in her eyes, the determination in her voice, the fire she carried even after everything she had endured. The air between them seemed to hum, charged with unspoken desires and the dangerous thrill of proximity. Clara rose slowly and knelt by the fire, close enough that Talon could see the fear and longing in her eyes. "You saved me today," she said softly, "not just from Caraway, but from the storm, from being lost. You could have left me." "You didn't, you—" Her voice faltered, but the meaning was clear. You're not silent because you don't feel. You're silent because you've been hurt. I see that now." Talon's hand twitched almost involuntarily as if drawn to her. He looked away, struggling with the vulnerability that had no place in the harsh canyon. But Clara didn't move back. She held his gaze, unflinching, offering him the one thing he had not allowed himself in 15 years. Trust. Finally he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "You're dangerous, Clara Whitfield. Not like the others. You've stirred something I thought was gone." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." The fire crackled, shadows dancing on the walls as two souls, scarred and cautious, began to inch closer. The night outside the cabin remained cold and silent, But inside, warmth spread not just from the fire, but from a growing, undeniable connection. Talon had survived countless battles, countless betrayals, but this quiet, stubborn, fearless woman had awakened something he had long thought lost. And as he studied her, he realized that for the first time in 15 years, he wanted more than survival. He wanted her. And in that moment, both of them understood the dangerous, beautiful truth. Love had found its way into the canyon, and there was no turning back. The sun sank low over the canyon, painting the rocks in deep shades of amber and blood red. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sage, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Clara and Talon crouched behind a ridge, watching the distant rise of Caraway's ranch through the hazy light. Today the past would meet the present, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she tightened the straps of her boots. She had prepared herself for the danger, for the confrontation, but nothing could steady her nerves like the sight of Caraway's men sprawling across the horizon. Armed and cocky, their leader at the center, arrogance radiating from every motion. He thinks he owns everything. Talon muttered, his voice a low growl. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife. The muscles of his forearm taut as steel. But today, he'll learn he's wrong. Clara swallowed hard. Her heart was a wild drum in her chest, but she couldn't look away. She had come to understand that Talon Gray wasn't just her protector. He was the canyon itself. Steady, silent, and dangerous beyond measure. As they approached the perimeter of Caraway's property, Talon's plan unfolded with the precision of a hunter who had stalked his prey for years. He guided Clara to the edge of a ridge overlooking the corral, and there he whispered, "Stay here. Do exactly as I say. One wrong move and he'll take advantage." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She watched as Talon moved like a shadow, blending with the canyon walls, disappearing and reappearing with calculated steps. His eyes never left Caraway, who was barking orders and laughing at his men's clumsiness. Then Talon struck. It began with a single shot, sharp, clean and precise, striking a post to startle the horses and scatter the men. Caraway cursed, spinning toward the ridge where he thought the shot had come from, but Talon had already moved. Rocks tumbled down the hillside, cutting off escape routes. Caraway's men faltered, unsure where the danger was coming from, while Talon remained hidden, striking with deadly efficiency. Clara watched, her breath catching in her throat. Talon was a storm unleashed, his knives flashing, his voice cutting through the chaos only when needed to command. He moved like a man possessed, every action deliberate, every blow calculated. She had never seen such controlled fury, such perfect harmony between skill and instinct. Caraway, realizing the tide had turned, drew his revolver and fired blindly, but Talon anticipated every move. The leader's gun was knocked aside, and with one final fluid motion, Talon disarmed him, sending the weapon spinning across the dirt. "Enough," Talon said, his voice carrying across the corral. "You will leave now. If you come back, you won't ride out." Caraway's face twisted with rage, but he knew he had lost. His men were retreating, some nursing bruises, others clutching minor wounds, all shaken by the ferocity of a man they had underestimated. Clara stepped forward, shaking, her hands brushing the edges of her skirts. Talon's eyes met hers, and for the first time in the chaos, they shared a smile. Small, private, full of unspoken relief and triumph. "You did it," she whispered. Talon's gaze softened for the briefest moment. "We did it," he corrected. Together, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon in shadow. The reckoning was over, but Clara knew the impact would linger. Caraway would not forget, and the valley, Talon's hidden sanctuary, would remain protected. More importantly, she understood something deeper. Talon Gray was not just a man hardened by loss. He was a man capable of love, of trust, and of hope, even after 15 years of silence. As they stood together in the cooling night, the canyon seemed to exhale, the shadows receding, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the quiet bond between them. Talon, once alone, and Clara, once lost, had faced the past and emerged together. And in that moment, both realized something terrifying and exhilarating. Their story was far from over. The night after the confrontation, the canyon seemed to breathe again, quiet and vast. Stars glimmered above like distant fires, and the wind whispered gently through the sandstone cliffs. Inside Talon Gray's cabin, The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows on the walls. Clara sat on the cot, knees pulled to her chest, thinking of everything that had happened: the storm, the ambush, Caraway's defeat, and the strange, electric bond she felt growing between herself and the silent Apache. Talon moved silently about the cabin, tending his knife and packing supplies. His eyes kept flicking toward her, shadowed with intensity, and Clara could feel the weight of his attention even without words. For 15 years his heart had remained closed, buried under grief and solitude. Now she was beginning to see the faint stirrings of something alive, something tender, and something terrifying. "You could leave," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "Go back to your solitude. You don't have to—" "No," he interrupted, his tone low but unwavering. "I'm not leaving, not now. Not when you're here." Her stomach fluttered, but fear lingered. The canyon, with all its beauty and danger, had always been his refuge. The walls of silence he built around himself were formidable, and yet she had crossed them without realizing she was even trying. "Clara," he said, kneeling beside her, "you have to understand. I haven't trusted anyone in 15 years. Not a soul. Not since I lost everything." His voice faltered slightly, just enough that she realized the depth of his pain. "And now you're here. You could leave tomorrow, or he could come back, or something worse could happen. And He stopped, and for a moment the air was thick with the weight of what he could not say. Clara reached out, placing her hand over his, steadying the tremor that ran through both of them. "You don't have to speak," she whispered. "I know you feel more than you let on. I see it." Talon's dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw a man grappling with choice. He could retreat, return to his canyon of silence, and continue guarding himself as he always had. Or he could take a risk that scared him more than any fight. He could open his heart to her and trust it wouldn't be broken. "I've spent 15 years alone," he admitted at last. "I've survived by staying quiet, by keeping my distance. If I open myself, I could lose everything again." "You won't," she said firmly. "Not this time. I'm not leaving." "I trust you, Talon." He exhaled a deep, shuddering breath as if the weight of the years had finally been acknowledged. Slowly he leaned closer, their hands still entwined, and for the first time in a decade and a half, the fortress around his heart cracked just enough for Clara to slip through. "I don't know if I'm ready," he whispered, the vulnerability in his voice raw. "But I do know. I don't want to go back to being alone." Clara smiled softly, lifting her hand to brush a strand of wet hair from his forehead. "Then don't stay with me. Let's face whatever comes together." The warmth of her hand, the sincerity in her eyes, ignited something inside him that had been dormant for years. A fire, quiet but unrelenting, began to burn. Talon Gray, the silent Apache, had faced countless dangers, outlived betrayals, and endured a lifetime of solitude. But now, confronted with love, he felt a fear unlike any other. And it thrilled him. Outside, the canyon whispered in the wind, the stars standing witness. Two hearts, scarred and cautious, had chosen to trust, to hope, and to step forward together. The choice was theirs, and both understood its weight and its promise. As Talon finally pulled her close, the night seemed to fold around them, the canyon holding its breath. The heart that had been silent for 15 years had made its choice. It had chosen her. Months passed, and the canyon settled into a rhythm that was both timeless and tender. The storms of the past, literal and figurative, had receded, leaving behind a land washed clean and a heart that had finally learned to beat again. Talon Gray, the silent Apache who had carried 15 years of grief and solitude, had found more than survival in the canyon. He had found Clara Whitfield. The cabin was no longer just a refuge. It was a home. Clara had made it so with small touches that brightened the space: hand-woven blankets on the cot, jars of dried herbs lining the shelves, and the faint smell of coffee always in the air. Talon had watched her, initially skeptical, slowly learning that the comfort she brought wasn't weakness but strength. He in turn had opened the cabin to the land, raising small crops, caring for the creek, and teaching Clara the ways of the canyon that had kept him alive for so long. They had learned each other's rhythms. Clara had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expressions, the flick of an eyebrow, the tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when she spoke. Talon had learned to listen, not just to the wind, or the creek or the distant cries of wildlife, but to the quiet pulse of her heart, steady and fearless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon walls, painting the cliffs in shades of copper and gold, they sat together on a ledge overlooking the valley. Talon's hand rested over hers, fingers interlaced. Silence stretched comfortably between them, filled not with words but with a shared understanding. "You never spoke for 15 years, Clara said softly, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. "I used to think it was anger or grief, but now I see it was something else. Waiting for the right person to knock at your door." Talon's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "And you did," he said quietly. "Knocked. And stayed. I never expected that," she laughed softly, leaning into him. "Neither did I. I thought I was lost. But maybe being lost brought me here, to you." The canyon responded in its own way. A gentle wind rustling the sage, a distant hawk calling into the twilight, the creek murmuring softly below. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment, to witness the bond forged between two souls who had both been broken and who had chosen to heal together. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a quiet, enduring rhythm. Talon and Clara worked side by side, tending the land, preparing food, repairing the cabin, and guarding the valley that had once been a secret sanctuary. Their love, born from danger and tempered by survival, became the heart of the canyon itself. Travelers who passed the canyon would whisper of a man and a woman who lived alone, yet whose laughter carried across the cliffs, and whose presence seemed to make the land feel alive. Some said that on quiet nights the wind carried faint melodies, an Apache love song, soft and haunting, rising from the canyon, telling the story of a heart that had been silent for 15 years, and of the woman who awakened it. Inside the cabin, Talon and Clara sat together by the fire one night, hands entwined. The shadows danced across the walls, echoing the journey they had taken, from fear, loss, and solitude, to trust, courage, and love. Talon traced the line of her jaw with a gentle finger, marveling at how fate had brought her to his door, and at how fully she had become part of his life. "You stayed," he whispered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I stayed," she replied, her smile warm and unwavering. "And you? You let me in." The canyon held its breath as if acknowledging the truth. Talon Gray's heart, silent for so long, had finally sung again, and the song, carried on the wind and through the cliffs, would echo across the valley for years to come, of love found in the most unlikely of places, of a woman who knocked at the wrong door, and of a man who finally let his heart respond. Together, they had survived storms, betrayal, and danger. Together they had chosen trust over fear, love over solitude, and in the quiet canyon, under the vast expanse of the desert sky, two hearts beat as one, the song of the canyon eternal and unbroken.